Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And Mike, this week we continue the dialogue around affordability. It's something that certainly has been front and center on people's minds, certainly with the just soaring housing prices. And that obviously creates a challenge for those of us who already own a home, for those of us who are trying to get into the housing market, but also it has an impact on the rental market and rental availability. Mike, in the last few episodes recently, we've talked about ways that we believe that if the government at all levels of government, truly wanted to put an effort towards mitigating this and calming the soaring prices, they could. Mike, I want to hand it over to you, maybe to give us a bit of a summary on what your thoughts are and some of those ideas.
Well, that at the root of all of the everything that is a crisis within housing, and that is low vacancy rates, climbing, escalating housing prices, and escalating rents even. At the root of that is a lack of availability of new housing stock. We've got more people coming into our country needing homes than at a faster rate than we're creating those homes. And I think rent control, if you look at it, and it's been studied, it deters the building of new rental purpose-built housing stock for rental. And once you start doing that, then that is only going to drive up the rental price of existing housing stock. And you also, well, there's other things there, but as we go, we'll talk in detail on a number of things. I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Well, certainly, Mike, we've talked about a few different things, and we talked about supply and demand being a factor. One of the ways that we indicate, okay, so let me just back up a little bit, actually, if I might. We talked about the challenge that the soaring prices have made it more difficult, certainly for first-time home buyers to get into the market and existing homeowners to make a lateral move within the market. And then you rightly offline, I think, made a comment that said, so of course, the logical thing for the government and regulators to do is to make it more difficult to qualify. In the mortgage industry, I talked about in a recent show, the fact that they've made that stress test a lot harder to get into. But then you just brought up the concept of rent control, and rent control by design intention was to ensure affordability for those who are not necessarily homeowners. What we're finding, Mike, and you asked me my thoughts. Well, I just recently, I think it was yesterday, came up across an article that was published about 3 days ago that I think is pretty much what you would refer to as a landmark ruling out of Berlin, Germany. And in Berlin, Germany, Germany had for the past year attempted to institute a rent control model themselves. And just 3 days ago, Berlin's highest court deemed it unconstitutional. They deemed it unconstitutional. And now what's happened is that I think landlords, from what I'm reading, are actually going to try and recover lost ground over the past year because it was deemed illegal and unconstitutional. Yeah. My personal opinion, Mike, is that this is going to have a ripple effect across other civilized, westernized countries across the world.
Yeah, it wasn't just that it was unwelcome or illegal. They looked at it and determined that the numbers in practice were actually detrimental to the overall housing flow of housing.
So, Mike, one might say. One might say somebody who is a tenant, somebody who struggles rightly and reasonably struggles to make rent in their current city, for example, might say, what are you talking about? How is it that this is a bad thing? And what I know from a different side and a different lens and a different perspective, we're saying, the courts are saying, excuse me, not we are saying, the courts are saying, hey, listen, this is stymieing, this is stopping the supply of new homes being built because it's pinching and squeezing and making it theoretically impossible for people to build at higher rates. Because as we know, labor costs go up, cost of materials go up. Yes. Certainly in the last year, the price of a piece of lumber has gone up over 300%. It makes it impossible to build new stock and yet maintain a controlled level of rent.
Yeah, well, if you want the free market to be the provider of a majority, if not all, of your rental housing stock, then there has to be a financial incentive there. They're not just going to take a loss and do it out of the goodness of their heart. It'd be nice if that could happen, but it doesn't. And
that's idealistic.
Yeah. And I'll create an analogy here. Like we've had rent control in one form or another since 1975, which has kept the year-over-year increase that a landlord is allowed to put on a rental rate for a tenant at 2% or less within that timeline. Many of those years, I mean, every 5 years for the past decade or so, we've seen housing prices double. So if in each of those years, rents were only allowed to increase by 2%, the analogy is this. Imagine if they did the same thing in the restaurant industry, where the price of goods sold in a restaurant could only go up by 2% or less every year. Do you not think the quality of service, the quality of the food would have eroded over time? Do you not think a lot of restaurateurs might have got out of the business and far fewer would be incentivized to want to get into the business if they had such controls there? So I think in any industry where you put controls on, there's going to be adverse effects. And certainly within the housing industry, although the intentions are good, I think that we're seeing detriment here. And where we're seeing
so Mike, as professionals in the industry, both on the finance side and in the real estate side, and outside of those fields as well, I think we can both agree. I trust we can both agree that we're not arguing a case against one or another. What we're saying, an ideology or a philosophy, we're saying intentions were there, for the best of intentions were there, but we're seeing what happens when. And anytime you artificially insert a control, it is not going to go without notice. It is not going to go without an equal or perhaps equally challenging response. We're going to have to go to break. When we come back, I do want to pick this up because we've talked about other forms of incentive and other forms of control that regulators and lawmakers, if you will, have attempted to better the system, and we've seen what's happened since. So we got to go to break. I want to come back to some of those simple laws of economics when we come back and talk about sort of our perspective or our answer to these questions. So stay with us on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And this week we are discussing housing affordability with a bit of a focus on the impact of rent and rent control. And Mike, before we went to the break, we were talking about the simple laws of economics, supply and demand, and how that's regulated. And Mike, you've got some more thoughts on it, and I'm glad.
Yeah.
Here's my quick takeaway is this, Mike, from what I'm hearing from you, is the more artificially we try to step in, the more harm actually we appear to be doing. Help me out with that analogy.
Yeah,
Mike.
well, going back to that restaurant analogy, if you're not, or if you're putting measures in place to control things, then obviously the quality of the end product is going to suffer. Now, if you leave that on its own, if I'm a restaurateur and I start cutting corners to my service and to the quality of my food, at the same time rising my prices, the market is going to speak up. They're not going to come through my door, and eventually I'm going to have to shut down. So there are checks and balances already in place with the free market. And the same checks and balances can and do apply to the real estate market. And so I think left to its own, it's not going to, I know there's a fear that if there were no government controls, rents would just go through the roof. Well, no, they wouldn't, because they would have to be kept in line with what people are willing to pay.
So let's put it this way, Mike. I don't think anybody's going to argue that affordability is an issue. There are varying degrees of affordability, and there are varying degrees in which people are feeling the impact of the rising prices, both on purchases as the resale market, for example, or the rental market. The reality is that the more the government steps in and disincentivizes, if you will, if that's the English word, those who would otherwise be building rental stock, the more that happens, the more damage is being done, because we're actually hurting the very people who need that stock. And if there was a balanced supply, or a more balanced supply, and a slightly higher vacancy rate, landlords and property owners would be competing for the valued tenant.
Yeah. And what's happening without that adequate supply, and coupled with the rising costs of homes, is more and more second and multiple suites are being built within single family homes, and not always being built in the light of day, where the government can then tax these properties, where we can go in and see that they're being built to code and they're safe. There's a whole underground economy of gray market apartments across the country. There's literally billions and billions of dollars, well, maybe just billions, not billions and billions of dollars of revenue that's being missed out on by the government. And that's money that could be collected and then put towards aiding people who are having difficulty in paying their rents. So I'm not saying that the government should be completely out of the housing and not be assisting anybody by saying rent control is not a good thing. There are other ways in which the government can help. And I think within that whole system, if done properly, the revenues are there to turn back to help those people who need the help most with housing.
Well, Mike, let's look at something that the Canadian marketplace in general provided as a response to rent controls. And that's not gray market. It was gray market-ish, in the sense that the government hadn't yet figured out how to get their fair piece of the pie with this. But that is really the very swift adoption of those who have additional properties or income properties moving towards the Airbnb model itself. And that was one that obviously was free of rent control. And there are a lot of people who said, hey, listen, I got to pay my mortgage somehow, or hey, this is an investment for my retirement because I don't have a pension, or I'm not employed, and I don't have benefits that some others might have. And this was their response. We can call it greed all we want. We can call it anything we want if we apply that lens to it. The fact of the matter is, somebody's got to pay the mortgage. And if you're upside down because the purchase price and your rents don't cover the costs, or don't equate to covering the costs, you got to make up for it somehow. So here's another thought, though, Mike. Certainly, rent affordability was an issue before today. But if anything has shown us the challenges that are faced by either individuals looking to build a home or renovate their home, or certainly those who are developers and home builders professionally who build homes en masse, we know that this past year has seen those prices soar. The price of materials has absolutely soared. It's got to go somewhere, and it goes to the end user, the one who's buying it. They got to cover the costs.
But I mean, ideally, it levels itself out once prices hit a point where people aren't willing to pay. We're in a weird, very unique situation here in Barrie, where a lot of our home buyers are selling in a market where homes are far more expensive, the GTA, and then coming here and driving up our prices, because still relatively speaking, they're less expensive. So that pushes the prices up, and that doesn't help things.
So, Mike, let me cut in there. It is important to apply context. And so you talk about affordability. Well, when you look at people, certainly the Toronto area itself is a population of approximately 3 million people. The greater Toronto area may have a population, I could be wrong, around 7 million or plus people there. And these are people who have either been living way above their means by what they believed was necessity to be in close proximity to work, or paying rents that are exorbitant and have kept them out of the market. And now technology has allowed them to move into the market. Certainly during this pandemic has catalyzed our move towards embracing technology and Zoom meetings like what we're doing right here. And they're moving to affordable places like Barrie population of 150,000 people. There may be 150,000 people who are feeling the squeeze on affordability. There's 3 million people less than an hour away who are saying, finally, I have access to something that's more affordable, because their jobs may still allow for that in terms of their wage, et cetera, deeming this affordable. So yes, it's important while there is an affordability crunch overall, it is important to apply some context.
Yeah.
Some people may not like that.
No. And well, at the same time, there's incentive to move around like that. We can't ignore the fact that this is a group of people who also had the ability to move about. Now, think about this: with rent controls in place, if you've been in your place for a number of years, your rents are relatively low compared to what they would be if you left that unit and went and rented a unit at today's prices. Because today, a new unit being rented or re-rented, you can ask more for that unit than you're able to get from the unit you've had rented for 5 years that's been kept under rent control. So that artificially holds people in place and more or less forces them to stay put. And I think our society and certainly our economy is better off when people feel the freedom to be able to move about for one reason or another, be it for a job or just for family reasons, whatever their incentive may be. And rent control, in effect, kind of holds people hostage in their lower rent house that they're in right now. And that's something Mike, to be considered.
Absolutely. We do have to go to break, and I'm just going to put out a bit of a buzzkill for our audience. I don't think we're going to solve this conundrum in the next 7.5 minutes or so of this show, but stay with us. We want to continue this conversation because I do think it's important for us to get an understanding and perspective of where we are. So stay with us. There'll be more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV Barrie right after this break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're talking about something that I don't know if it's winnable or not. We're talking about housing affordability and in particular, the impact of rent control. Now, in Berlin, just 3 days ago, it was decided by the High Court that rent control was both illegal and unconstitutional. I'm arguing that that is not going to go unnoticed. I'm arguing that other democracies around the free world are going to see this and realize, this has set a precedent. My opinion here, I recognize, Mike, that for all the right reasons, governments have tried to interject and inject either controls, restrictions, or stimulus for the greater good. And we're seeing that it's backfiring. And to quote, this is in the article from Bloomberg News. It says here, as the late Swedish economist S.R. Lindbeck memorably put it, in many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. Now, obviously, that is a very blunt statement being made. Excuse me. Sure. But how do we do this? How do we look at this? We recognize here locally that we've tried things, Mike, and I'm going to suggest to you, I want to take this conversation in a little bit of a direction here. Certainly in the city of Barrie, the city has recognized that which is the, tougher of the two, to allow homelessness, to allow those who are perhaps at the lowest point in their life to continually cycle through the spiral of homelessness, which equals likelihood of getting involved in things to do out of desperation, which could lead to hospitalization for self-harm. It could lead to incarceration because of some of these things. Yeah. And the cost associated with addressing that is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars versus the government saying, hey, it's going to cost us money, but let's put some money, let's invest some money into some programs that will catch people before they fall. Why aren't we taking that same approach to affordable housing? Why isn't the government truly, if they want to keep housing affordable, instead of capping rent control, instead of doing those types of things, which are actually killing supply, why aren't we investing in making housing supply happen?
Well, I think by investing in housing supply, that you create a revenue stream, you create additional revenues. You take money that's right now, as we mentioned earlier, going into an underground economy, and it brings it back out, and that's money that can be reapplied. And many of the measures we take now locally to deal with homelessness and provide shelter, they're ad hoc measures. I mean, they're all well-intended, they're all good, but there's a very, very high cost in doing it by those means. It's a very tough question, Arif, though, because if you look at Germany, that was a a court decision. When you leave it to government to make this decision, if we look back, there was a time within the last 20 years, and I forget under what government, where they tried to make changes to the Landlord Tenancy Act. And I believe it was they created a rent review board. So they took it out of the court system hands if there were any challenges, and it would then go to a rent review board. And something as simple as that, I recall there was a lot of backlash that came from the public. So to be realistic, I think any government that would look at making across the board changes to rent controls would be likely to back away, that it's just not going to be well received in the short term.
Certainly, Mike, there's an election coming up. The question is around political will. The question is around popularity. Is this going to happen? But I'm arguing to a certain degree, if we've already recognized that sometimes the government needs to step in because the cost of not stepping in is greater, and we can actually invest in people, and we can keep families together, and we can keep families safe, and that will actually diminish the burden on the system. Here's the thing, Mike. We've tried things for decades, and they're just proving that they don't work. These methods that you've talked about are unsustainable. My argument is, while it may, the market, the development community is saying, hey, you know what, to remediate brownfields is cost prohibitive. It puts us upside down. No one will buy our product. Therefore, brownfields sit. We've got government supply by the way of abandoned buildings, schools, hospitals, government buildings in general that could be converted into multi-unit supply of housing. We've got brownfields, former factories that are sitting contaminated. No one will touch them. It's easier to go wide and build something new and save perhaps 5-10% on the cost of a building. If the government was to invest in those, yes, some people will say, well, you're assisting private enterprise, and how dare you assist private enterprise? But isn't that an equivalent to the same type of investment that would allow us to have that supply that would actually bring the prices down?
Yeah, well, there's a cost regardless, and it's all of us that are paying that cost. We say it's government, but the funds have to come from somewhere, and we talked about that in previous episodes about some of the things we can and should be doing, and things we could be doing better, and incentives government could be creating that are going to have the net effect of more housing being built. And until we get to that point where we're doing some, if not all of those things, the other thing that I mentioned is there's so much real estate in the GTA that all our government offices and functions seem to be housed within that GTA. Start spreading that out. That's going to stimulate economies across the province. That's going to create a lot of revenues from selling those lands that can then be put back into the system in the interest of affordable housing. There's much. And the white paper that the Ontario Real Estate Association put together recently, and perhaps we can provide a link on our Hitting Home with Mike and Arif website that talks about that. They go through a 15-point plan that is going to help to create housing stock in Ontario. And it's a detailed report. It's an interesting read, strangely enough, for a white paper, but worthy.
No, and you're absolutely right, because one would think that they're going away from serving their own membership, which is to sell houses. But Mike, one thing is for sure, I think we can both agree, and I hope even our entire audience can agree. I don't care necessarily which side you're coming from, but the way we've always done it isn't working and hasn't worked, and it is time to look at new, fresh ideas that might in effect irk some people. It might actually cost us a little bit in the short run. The question is, have we thought it all the way through? Do we really think about all of the different elements that are at play? And certainly, you can't necessarily go directly to the person who's most immediately impacted, because they're tunnel vision and focused on their immediate needs. So we have to look broader. We got to go, Mike. We're out of time on this show. I certainly think we could do a few more episodes on this, but I'm glad that we're addressing it, and I see us addressing it more in the future. We'll see you again next time on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif.